I'm Steve Bell, Chairman and CEO of Tennesse Bank Trust. We are a privately owned bank with offices in Cool Springs and Green Hills. We are a business that happens to be a bank, and our customers tell us the difference is clear.
John, I'd like to start with you and maybe have you set the stage with a definition of negotiation and how pervasive it is in our lives.
Sure, Paula. I define negotiation as a strategic communication process to either get a deal or to resolve a problem. The two essential elements of that definition are communication and process. That's part of every single negotiation. The piece, though, that is not a part of every single negotiation, which we hope will be, is the idea of strategy. Many times we ask people, well, where in life do you engage in a strategic communication process to get a deal or to resolve a problem? And many people will say, well, I have a 16-year-old, and there's a moment where you engage in this process on a daily basis with your 16-year-old. Many people will say, I have employees, and there are moments where you've got to negotiate with your employees. And so one of the things to recognize about negotiation is that it is both a professional skill as well as a personal skill. So just to give you a quick anecdote, my life in the Lowry house goes something like this throughout the night. And what happens is about 1 or 2 in the morning, I've got a 7-year-old and a 5-year-old and an 8-month-old, and either my 7 or 5-year-old is going to come running down the hall wanting to hop in bed with mommy and dad. And
Sure.
There's a moment where my first negotiation of the day is with my wife about who is going to get up and take care of the 7 or 5-year-old. My second negotiation of the day is with my 7 or 5-year-old that shows up at the door ready to come into bed. And so I think it's an illustration to say for many of us, especially those of us with young kids, we negotiate a couple of times before we even wake up, before we even get to the office. It's something that we're doing all the time.
So Elizabeth, I'd like to ask you, because you work as an advisor to businesses, where do you find it important in your daily life?
I think negotiation is, as John said, a conversation. And years ago someone said, when you have interest in common and interest in conflict happening at the same time, you're in a negotiation. Because if you have no interest in common, then there's no point in even talking. And if you have total agreement, then it's not really a negotiation. When you keep those in mind, it's always balancing what the other needs and wants, what you need and want, and how you can help fulfill their needs without sacrificing what you're truly trying to accomplish.
And so what are some of the elements or the descriptors of a good negotiation?
One aspect is the substance of the negotiation, and that's where many people put a lot of their focus. Some of the language that you see in this field, like BATNA, your best alternative to a negotiated agreement, that has to do with the substance. But then there is also process, and the process is absolutely critically important. And so as we think about negotiation, people quickly become experts in the substance. Britnie, you're an expert in terms of real estate. Darrell, you're an expert in terms of technology and people. The reality, though, is many times that's not enough. You need more than just substantive expertise. You also have to know how to master the process of putting a deal together. And the one thing that you'll see is if you don't get the process piece right, then the substance piece loses its relevance, because the deal happens when you get both.
Britnie, I thought I'd ask you, you do these great real estate deals, and you must have to negotiate deals all the time. Do you find it challenging to do that, and do you have any words of wisdom?
Every person you deal with wants a different outcome, and I'm always focused on creating a win-win. I feel like that's the most important thing, and if they're winning and I'm winning, and that's the goal, and it's great. My biggest thing I keep in mind is to remember that he who listens least loses. And if I can just pay attention to what they want, I can figure out a solution for us both to come away with a great deal and what we wanted out of the situation.
Darrell, I mean, you've been growing your company like gangbusters, so, and I know that you've had to negotiate along the way. Have you
Absolutely.
What are your words of wisdom about what you've dealt with?
Number one, try to find a win-win. Try to find a situation where the person can feel that you're negotiating with can feel good about the outcome and you can feel good about the outcome. I think it's when we walk in the door and we want the entire pie that causes some problems, but understand that going in that everybody's not going to get everything that they want, including you. And so if you go in there with that mentality, and then if you listen carefully to the clues of what's important to the person that you're negotiating with, it helps you get to that deal point. And so last evening we had negotiated with a new executive in the Denver market, and the deal was done, but over about a 4 or 5 hour period, she got another offer. Well, then we had to open up negotiations again, and so we negotiated a new deal with her that was better than the deal we had done before. But still, it was still a win-win for both of us. She walked away feeling that she was getting the bag that she wanted based on her new level of interest from somebody else, and we still feel that she's going to deliver what we need in that marketplace. And we all have to search for those win-wins. As entrepreneurs, we can't afford to walk away from the table without coming up with a win-win, because each opportunity we must take advantage of it and find a way to win.
Darrell, your story reminds me of a quote from J. Paul Getty. He said, if you have to make every penny in a deal, chances are you won't have very many deals. And so he recognized this is a process that involves some give and take.
Of course.
And there are many people that they come into it really competitively, and what they experience is not the gains of competition, but the costs of competition. And the cost of competition are, if you aren't willing to give a little bit, then many times people, they might do business with you once, but they're probably not going to do business with you twice.
And people get emotional. Elizabeth?
Yes, they do get emotional. The win-win, I think, is an important point. I think it's also really important when you are preparing to have one of those conversations to say, what are my objective outcomes? Where do I want to end up? And then to really check your gut and say, where am I emotionally? Because when people think of negotiation as a competition, is that they want to somehow be the conqueror, the winner, the one who shows the other one who's boss. And when people come in with that attitude, they may end up getting the emotional outcome they want to feel good and lose the deal. So it's important to be able to separate those two, and if you can let the other person win their emotional outcome, you can frequently get a better rational outcome for yourself.
I just read a study, and we talked about, I sent it around, that when women are negotiating for their own salary, they don't do as good a job as they do when they're negotiating for someone else's salary.
You sent that article around, and I was in the process of negotiating with a female executive. She did not have any problems negotiating for what she wanted and then renegotiated when she had a better offer. It's very difficult for us to overgeneralize any group of people. I think it depends on the person.
I do agree with that, but I also have to say I've been around men negotiating with each other and women negotiating, and it is so different. And you're nodding.
Yes. Several years ago, a woman named Helen Fisher Smith, who is an anthropologist, and she talks about deep history. And in deep history, the reason that men's and women's brains are actually wired differently is because men had to make a binary decision. Do I kill the tiger or run from the tiger? And women had to say, I've got to keep the baby from falling out of the cave. I've got to keep the other one out of the fire. All the time I'm skinning the tiger meat, and all the time I'm doing the stew. So that women developed biologically into what's called deep context decision makers. We tend to take more things into consideration. And because the men were out hunting, they had to literally kill or be killed, whereas women were quote, successful and survived in terms of their ability to collaborate and share with other women. So the article about women being less aggressive when negotiating for themselves may be part of, I can negotiate for you because the mother lioness comes out and says, I am going to protect my friend or my brood, whereas for themselves, certainly culturally, and I think maybe even more so in the South, that women were the protectors and the gatherers and the second placers.
Do you ever negotiate with someone who you really think doesn't want the deal to be done? You're in a negotiation, you're talking, you're listening, you're doing all the things we've talked about, and suddenly you realize this man, woman, whatever, just really doesn't want to do this deal. And how do you deal with that?
I found it's best to have an immediate interrupt. So do a pattern break, start laughing, say, let's do this another day.
I think Britnie is right on. And another way to create a break in a tense conversation is to ask a question. I've sometimes used this with groups who are having difficult conversations, is to just say, what do you think is making this so difficult? And then when you're quiet, it gives people a chance to think and to go inward instead of that constant defend, 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 or attack, attack, attack. And it can shift the whole energy in what's happening.
And I think you have to show compassion for the person you're negotiating with. And sometimes what they decide is a win for them and what you decide is a win for you, you got to be respectful of that. And you got to be respectful of what they want. So you have to let them win. I mean, my wife, we play games with our kids all the time. I never let them win. Never, under any circumstance. But she lets them win. But when I go into the business world, there are situations where I know that I have to let them win. And so, and I don't have a problem with that, but you have to let the other person feel like they got a victory. And there's nothing wrong with that.
You know, I think negotiation is easier when you realize you're negotiating. But I think so many times through life, through the day, you don't realize you just entered into a negotiation. When you talk about that process, what do you mean?
I think there's something that is very systemic and predictable about negotiation. The most important move in a commercial, especially a competitive kind of negotiation, is the very first move. And the key is if you're ambitious enough and you allow yourself enough room to provide some concessions along the way, that gives the other side the sense that they're winning because they're seeing you make concessions to try to get the deal.
Do you try to make the first concession?
I try to make the first move.
First move.
I think the making the first move, and there's a lot of research to back this up, and I know it's very counterintuitive. Putting the first number on the table has a psychological anchor. And every number that follows gets compared to that first number. And so we have this moment all the time where, at Lipscomb, we've got vendors that come to us and say, what's your budget? I love that question because it gives me the opportunity to psychologically influence them in terms of what we're talking about. They would be far more effective if they came in and said, I think I've got a good understanding of your needs. In order to provide that service or that product or whatever it is, you're looking at this number. Now they got to be able to come off that number, but at the same time, what will happen then is they will psychologically influence me because the numbers that follow, they will be anchored to that number that they've put on the table.
Also, when you're negotiating, establishing some terms up front. For example, I was negotiating for a piece of property that I was buying from a bank, and I didn't want to offend the person with my offer. So I said, hey, I want you to understand this is my first offer. Don't want to offend you in any way, but this is what I think it's worth. And letting the person know that you're not trying to offend them or take it all. He took my offer, which I was kind of heartbroken that he took my offer, but I did want to make sure that I was not trying to offend him. And so it happened, they just really wanted out of this property.
And
it was a win-win.
There was probably trust there, Darrell. I mean, you have a great reputation.
Thank you.
People trust you, and everybody around this table the same way. So, but it's one thing to negotiate with someone you know and trust and have a relationship with. And what's the difference between that and when you're really negotiating with a stranger, someone you don't know, you don't have a history with, and you haven't had time to build a relationship with?
A different question, I would make a slight turn on that, is do you anticipate having an ongoing relationship with the person that you're negotiating with. I was in an art gallery, and the chances of my seeing that art dealer again were very, very small. So it was very easy for me to push hard on the price because, number one, it was a concrete, tangible object that was not going to change as a result of the negotiation. The second is that there was not going to be an ongoing relationship, because if you beat up somebody in a negotiation and cause them to feel like they have been vanquished and now they're supposed to come in and be happy about working with you, it's like, not going to happen, not going to happen.
But so what do you do when you have a negotiation, you've come to terms, and now all of a sudden the other guy double thinks it and says, oh, you know what, nah, let's try to change that a bit.
Like last night with the executive from Denver.
You had a miserable night.
No. Let's say if you're negotiating to buy this glass of water, and you and I are talking, and we're saying, well, hey, 10 cents for the glass of water, and we said you're going to deliver that next month, and then along the way somebody says, hey, it's worth $20 now. I mean, you may come back to me and say, hey, we struck this deal, but can we talk about it a little bit more? And then me on the other end say, well, okay, I understand the value of it has gone up since we talked about it. And so negotiations are always flexible. They're always fluid. And so in the service business, you have to be flexible, you have to be fluid, because people's situations and circumstances change.
The first negotiation that people have to manage is the negotiation within themselves. And there's tension between the desire to cooperate and the desire to compete. And so that tension goes on within each one of us. And one of the things that Darrell mentioned in terms of the flexibility is the reality is there could be many moments within the same negotiation where strategically it's very wise to be cooperative. And then literally in the same negotiation, it becomes wise to become competitive. So kind of a fun way that we illustrate this is everyone fold your arms for me for just a second, just like this, okay? Now, what I want to have you do is take the arm that's on the bottom and put it on top. Now, how does that feel?
Awkward.
It's awkward. It's uncomfortable, right? And the reality is that many times people negotiate based on what comes natural to them. And some people are naturally more competitive. Some people are naturally more cooperative. And they can't change. They can't be flexible. And so as a result, if you're cooperative and you're predictable, you're going to be exploited. If you're competitive and you can't come off the competition, you're going to lose deals that you otherwise should have had. And so the person who gets the best deals is the person who, this is the way I'd like to do it. This is more comfortable, but if I need to, even though this isn't comfortable, even though it feels awkward, I can be effective operating just like this if I have to.
One of the things I find in my work with CEOs is that people have become successful using a certain style, and they have a very narrow band or repertoire of responses because this is the way they are, and they can't go beyond that. So I compare it to the person who has the watch that stopped. It's absolutely perfectly on time twice a day, and it's wrong the rest of the time. And goodness knows we know that there's huge complexity in the world, and we need to be able to have multiple styles and multiple approaches, and sometimes that's going to require us to stretch beyond what our default position is.
There's also different forms of negotiations. So we've been talking about negotiating, getting what you want, what the other person wants. But when you establish a 50-50 partnership with another person, I mean, what I like to do in those situations, I start out with a divorce. If this process doesn't work out when we start this business, let's start out with how we're going to split. And that's you negotiating the end of life for this relationship. I think it's a smart thing to do, because oftentimes if you're in a 50-50 partnership with a person and it goes south, you need to figure out how you can get out, right? And it's hard to do that, but you figure that out. You negotiate that on the front end. Then you have the guidelines of the relationship established.
It's like a prenuptial agreement.
Yes.
You want to have those hard conversations while there's still high levels of
Yes.
trust and love.
And are there times when you should let someone else do your negotiating for you? How do you decide when you need to hire a mediator or or let's say you do it, I can't handle it?
So sometimes if you're in an organization and you're the CEO or the founder, and the other company you're negotiating with a vice president, you may want to have one of your vice president level people negotiate. You don't want the CEO negotiating with somebody on the lower rung of the organization, because you don't want to elevate how important it is to the organization, because then they start to think, well, we can get much more because the founder's here.
It also gives a recourse.
Yes, absolutely.
It gives you a way to, well, I'll have to check with the CEO, or I have to check with the board. It's another way of calling a pause.
Many times lawyers will get hired to go negotiate on behalf of folks. But also, especially in the litigation context, there are many larger clients that won't let the lawyers negotiate for them. And it's fascinating because they don't trust the lawyers to be good stewards of the resources. And so you'll come into a room like this and the lawyer's there to provide legal counsel, but the lawyer's not making the decisions in terms of what the concessions are. And so I think what it comes down to, if we go back into our definition, Paula, if you're not a master of the process, or you don't have confidence in your ability or someone else's ability to master that process and to manage it really well, then it probably makes sense to get someone at the table who is a master of that process. The other thing, and you mentioned a mediator, if the communication is not healthy, that's where the mediator can be so valuable to help facilitate the communication. And then in other cases where you just don't have the substantive expertise and so you can't make good strategic decisions, then it's important to get someone there who can help with that piece of it. So I think there's an easy way to kind of make that decision. Do I understand the strategy so I know where to go when the opportune time comes? Is there a good communication process that allows us to put this deal together? And am I master of the process to where I can manage it in a way that's going to deliver a good outcome?
And I don't want to overgeneralize. I said I wouldn't do that at the very beginning. But lawyers, you want to bring them in after the spirit and the tone and you're close to getting a final deal. If you bring them in first, they will ruin the deal.
We have such a great reputation, don't we, Darrell?
And I used to say early in my career, you know, when you're a small business person, you're negotiating with a giant company. When you walk in the room and you know you only got 10 employees and you're the person, you wouldn't bring your lawyer along with you to make you seem like you're bigger than what you are. I did it a couple times, and the lawyer ruined the deal because he or she they were trying to prove their worth to the person I was negotiating with, and I had to say, hey, I'm fine with those terms they're talking about. Please be quiet. So
Stand down, please.
Yeah, so I've learned to work out the spirit of the negotiation, get 95% of it done, and then bring the lawyer in to help paper the deal after that point. But having them set in the negotiations at the very beginning, you will never get the deal done.
I'm actually really strategic on who I use, and this is one of those moments where you get to pick your ego, your pride, and also you get to test your level of control. How much control do you need to have over the situation? So I pick a person, be it in my organization or an attorney, and I think about who we're negotiating with, and I'm like, who would have the best rapport with that person? Because rapport is everything.
And so how do you teach your employees to be good negotiators?
Our crew, like y'all's, they want to produce, they want to look good for the bank or your company, and they want to bring business in. But they should not feel like they have to get every deal. In reality, we will get most of the deals we should get. But the pricing won't be, or the structure or the terms won't be what we would like to have if they feel a sense of desperation. The other thing that we had to work on was letting them have some framework of how much latitude they have. There's certain things we can't give on. We can give on pricing, we can give on terms, we can give on...
So I get a 1% deal?
You get a 1% deal.
You are good.
Negotiations,
But Darrell, we want to talk about the next part of it because we view that as the tip of the spear with you, so we're going to do more later on.
Exactly.
That's interesting.
So those are the things that we've tried to make our crew more comfortable, that they can go, they don't have to win, they can go through the transaction, and they can say, let me think about that overnight, because virtually never does the other party think that's an unreasonable thing to ask.
Sure. And so what do you do if you've negotiated a deal, you're getting toward the end of it, and all of a sudden you realize you have just given away the store? Can you gracefully say, you know, I'm sorry, I need to go back and tell you that I think I made a mistake here?
that's just part of the process. I mean, you're going to make some mistakes in negotiating, and you have to live with those mistakes.
Paul, let me go back to what Roddy was saying for just a second, because I think there's an important point here in terms of helping your people prepare for this process that they will be engaged in every single day. Abraham Lincoln once said, if you have 8 hours to chop down a tree, you should spend 6 hours sharpening your axe. So taking 15, 20 minutes before a big meeting with a client to work with somebody and say, talk to me a little bit, give me a sense of your strategy, map this for me, that's a very valuable 20 minutes to spend with someone.
And sometimes when you're negotiating, the person you're negotiating across the table from, they just want to know if you're willing to negotiate. It took me about 2 years to buy a car because the dealership wouldn't negotiate at all. I wanted the car, but they wouldn't negotiate at all.
And here's the mistake that people make, Darrell, is that in an effort to be reasonable, or in an effort not to offend, or in an effort to try to get the deal done, they start way too low. And so when the person on the other side comes back and says, come on, make me a deal, I say, I've already given everything away. I can't make you a deal. And so in response to that, people look very rigid. And they say, and you have moments like Darrell, where it's like, come on, give me a couple $1,000 off the car and I'll buy the car. And because the dealer won't, there's 2 years that have gone by where Darrell's driven by the lot and said, man, I wish they'd give me
I really want that car.
But that's actually a business model, isn't it? I mean, there's specifically with a car company that says
might
no
be.
negotiation. We come in and that's the price, and they say, we're the lowest price, we're the best
But
price.
I'm not going to get that feeling that I'm looking for if I don't get how about just $200 off? I mean,
How about
I just want to feel better about.
How about they just
buying
take you
it.
to dinner?
something.
Anything.
It's important to know who you're negotiating with. And if the person you're negotiating with has got to feel like they got something, then realize that and give them dinner.
I want to go back to a point that you made earlier, right at the very beginning. If you identifying what you can offer someone that may not cost you anything, and vice versa. So one way of doing it, it's an old process, is you sort of make a list and say, these are the outcomes that I'd really like. And these are the assets that the other side has that could help me get some of what I want without it being about price. And then you do the reverse for the other person or for the other side and say, what do I have? And that makes the pie bigger, just as you said. And I think can also be an important part of the planning when you're thinking about that negotiation, because it may have been easy for him to say, knowing that he's got a special deal from the manufacturer that they are giving away, I don't know, coupons for a year's worth of free gas, or whatever it is that's not going to be...
It's not going to hurt you.
It's not going to hurt you.
We call that no sleeves out of your vest. It's not going to cost you anything. It's already a vest.
People take positions in this process, but there's always interests that are underneath the positions that drive people to take those positions. I remember the first case I ever had practicing law. We went out to a lady's house, and she'd been injured in a hospital, and we were trying to negotiate the resolution of this case, and we asked her what she wanted. And the things that she said, number one, I need to be able to go back to that hospital because that's where my doctor admits his patients. Number two, she said, I'm old school, and if you do something to hurt someone, you should apologize. And she goes, the third thing that's important to me is I was a nurse for 20 years, and I just want to make sure that things are being done right in the hospital. So if you listen to those three things, notice she never said money. Money wasn't the driving factor, although what brought this lawsuit was this demand for $150,000. And yet, where it got resolved was because someone in a mediation looked across the table and said, ma'am, I'm sorry for what happened to you, and you can come back to our hospital anytime. And once that happened, the money, we worked it out just like that.